All right, greetings, family. This is Dayvon Love, Director of Public Policy, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. Just want to say Happy New Year to all those that haven't, heard from us, in 2023. Happy Black History Month. We're looking forward to, this General Assembly and being able to tell you all about the work that we're doing and some of the other work that's happening in our community that's going to impact Black people. I just want to remind those of you that aren't familiar with Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, we're a grassroots political think tank advocating on the issues that face Black people, directly, revolutionary Pan-African nationalist perspective in terms of dealing with the issues that face our community, unapologetically Black. And we're an advocacy organization that's powered by the community. As you'll notice in, the heading that you see, people are able to become sustainers to support the work we do. And as I discuss some of the work that we're doing in the Maryland General Assembly, it'll become clear why the kind of advocacy that we do is important for you to support if you're interested in true revolutionary change in our community. So, with that, welcome to Streets of the Statehouse. This is our podcast that we do. We do this live in order to provide just updates. Sometimes we send out written legislative updates that gives people a sense of, an update as to what's happening in the legislature, particularly as it relates to the things that we're working on and things that we're following. This provides an even greater level of detail and updating you all on what's happening with legislation that we're pushing in the Maryland General Assembly. One of the things I want to emphasize before I get into the content of what I want to say to the public about the work that we're doing is that that much of the work that we do in terms of legislative advocacy, in addition to it being powered by the community supporting us, we're also a unique organization because we really rely on you all to reach out to your legislators to put pressure on them in order to push our advocacy efforts forward. So this podcast is really designed to provide the information necessary for people to use the power that you all have in order to impact legislation and policy that impacts Black people. All right. So with that, what I want to do first is I'm gonna talk broadly about the state of our sense of the Maryland General Assembly. I'll talk about some of our legislative priorities, and then I'll give you a sense of where we think things are with our legislative priorities. So first, I want to, and just, again, for those who aren't as familiar with the Maryland General Assembly, it's a 90-day period between January and April where Maryland state representatives convene and make policy that governs the state of Maryland. And so the Maryland General Assembly in Maryland has a Democratic Party supermajority. So we have in the House of Delegates in one chamber, in the Maryland State Senate in the other chamber, Democrats with a veto-proof majority. So in a traditional kind of checks and balances government, three different branches of government system, when the legislature passes a piece of legislation, the governor can veto, but the legislature with a certain number of votes, typically something like 2/3, are able to override the veto of the governor for a piece of legislation the governor vetoed to become law. Well, in Maryland, as I'm sure many of you know, for the past 8 years, 2 terms, we've had a Republican governor, former Governor Larry Hogan. And that presented a very interesting dynamic as it relates to the relationship between the legislature and the governor, the executive. And because the legislature had a supermajority, there were a lot of bills that the legislature passed that the governor vetoed that were overwritten by the legislature. In many ways, and one of the things that LBS has made commentary about in a variety of places, is that in many ways, when the Democratic nominee for governor in 2014, Anthony Brown, lost to Larry Hogan, it created an impetus for the Democratic Party to be pushed further to the left and further into issues that impact Black people in ways that it had not previously. So you look at some of the criminal justice reform that the Maryland General Assembly has done. Even look at, some of the more recent changes around cannabis legalization, some of the work around police accountability and transparency. These are all things that, from our vantage point, it forced the Democrats to in many ways behave more progressively than they have in the past under Democratic Party leadership. I mention that because, again, I'm sure as many of you know, we have a new Democratic governor, Governor Wes Moore, who is a resident and considers his home Baltimore City, and is the first Black person to occupy the position as governor of the state of Maryland. And there is much, excitement about him taking the governor's mansion for the Democrats. There's a lot of people who are inspired by Governor Moore and the vision that he's articulated. He gave his State of the State speech. I won't, talk too much about that because I want to talk more about the policies that govern the legislature. But I do want to say in the outset that in terms of legislative work, we are operating in many ways in relatively new terrain, where we're in a context where now the Democrats control both the governor's mansion and the legislature, right? And so this poses different dynamics. And one of the sentiments that we've heard expressed in a number of contexts, put in a phrase, is this being a new day, right? And I think a lot of people are banking a lot on Wes Moore being governor as something that'll be a catalyst for change. And so I think it's really important, for us to have an analysis of exactly what the potential is for meaningful, substantive policy change in the interest of Black people, particularly working class Black people, in around the state of Maryland. What I want to say about this are two things, and some of what I'm about to say are reflected in a Maryland Matters piece that I wrote that was published this summer that talked about some of the things that we think is going to be important for people to be vigilant about as it relates to this new dynamic, where again the Democrats control both the governor's mansion and the legislature. So two things I want to say about this notion of a new day. The first is that it's extremely important to know that the tactics that the Democratic Party has historically used and contemporaneously uses in order to peddle its legitimacy, peddle the notion that it's delivering for Black people, is often being able to pass policies that in many ways are symbolic and avoiding addressing the policies that are truly systematic and revolutionary. And so, what it's important for us to pay attention to is whether or not, again, with this new arrangement, whether the Democratic Party will become more conservative, right? Or whether or not the Democratic Party will push further and address itself to policies that have been difficult to pass in this so-called progressive state, in this state that has a Democratic Party supermajority. And again, I'll talk some about some of the policies in a moment. But there are key policies that are truly impactful for the lives of Black people that we need to make realistic assessments as to whether the viability of these policies have increased. It's also important to note that, of course, in addition to Governor Moore, we have two relatively new presiding officers in Speaker Adrian Jones and Senate President Bill Ferguson. They're still relatively new in their positions. And those of us that were engaged in legislative advocacy under Miller and Bush as the presiding officers, in terms of, the bar for what progressive things can move out of the legislature, to be frank, I mean, the bar was in hell, right? That the smallest minute things that came out that were progressive were celebrated because I think most people, they were making an honest assessment of the politics of the legislature under the regime of Bush and Miller was extremely conservative. I mention that because while I think we do have presiding officers that are objectively more progressive than their predecessors, again, as Malcolm X once said, you don't put a knife in a person's back 9 inches, pull it out 3, and say you made progress. And so we don't want to celebrate things that are good, the things that may not have otherwise come out of a Miller and Bush legislative regime, but settle for that as progress. That it's really important that progress is actually things that are transformative and revolutionary for Black people. And so I think in this new day arrangement, it's going to be very important that we're vigilant about the policies. We're vigilant about the political behavior of folks in the legislature and of the new governor. It's important that we're vigilant about the real material outcomes of the moves that they make, not get caught up in personality, not get caught up in, liking a person or liking the fact that Democrats, have expanded their majority in the previous election. Those things are important things to take note of, but we should be vigilant in watching what passes, what are the policies that are being pushed forward, and make objective assessments that way, right? So that's our perspective on this new arrangement of having a Democratic governor in the Statehouse. All right, so I'm going to talk about Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle's legislative agenda briefly, and just give you a sense of what's happening with them. Session is still only a few weeks in, so things are still in the process of moving forward. So just wanted to give you all a heads up, and you'll be, again, as always, seeing the legislative updates that we produce. So one of the issues that LBS has been working on over the past several years at this point is cannabis legalization. The importance of LBS's perspective on cannabis is that we're clear that cannabis legalization is a political inevitability, right? So we're not advocating from the perspective of folks that are primarily interested in consuming cannabis. We were clear that because it's a political inevitability, right, that I think at this point there may be 20 or 21 states that have legalized. In addition, it's extremely important to note that it is cannabis prohibition that has played a major role in carrying out the war on drugs that has decimated many of the communities that have been impacted negatively, that have been devastated by the war on drugs. And so it's important to note that in the light of cannabis legalization, it is these major white-owned companies that are getting most of the wealth from this emerging business. And so the reason we focus so much on cannabis legalization is both our recognition of the impact that cannabis prohibition has had as a matter of policy on driving the war on drugs that has negatively impacted our community, and recognizing that cannabis legalization provides an opportunity for real substantive Black collective wealth acquisition that in addition to deal with the criminal justice work that needs to be done, provide the kind of investment in communities that is necessary to truly repair the harm that's been done by the war on drugs. So that really, hope that helps to explain the rationale behind our pretty consistent focus over the past few years on cannabis legalization. So one of the things that we know, one of the things that we know had to be addressed is the use of the odor of cannabis as the sole basis for probable cause for search and seizures. That oftentimes law enforcement has used just the mere smell of odor as the pretext for a traffic stop. And when you look at the data, Black people are overrepresented in those that are charged with cannabis possession and convicted. And this leads to increased interactions with law enforcement. And so it's important that we're clear that the sole use of odor as a pretext in a world where cannabis is legalized, our concern is that it creates a context where Black folks will be potentially even more vulnerable to interactions with law enforcement post legalization of recreational cannabis, which is at odds with the rhetoric that the Maryland General Assembly espoused about the importance of cannabis legalization. That the legislature, its leadership, many of them talked about the racial disparities as one of the rationale behind cannabis legalization. But if the sole use of odor of a law enforcement officer is able to be used as a pretext to increase interaction with law enforcement, we're clear that increased interactions of Black folks with law enforcement create opportunities for the kind of misconduct and police brutality, that we've seen recently, and that we continue to see on a daily basis. So it's important, and so one of our policies is to remove the sole use of odor searches as the basis for probable cause for search. That is SB 51. And that bill was actually heard today in the Senate Judicial Proceedings Committee. We'll likely post a video from one of the panels in that committee, so you can see the discussions and what advocates in support were saying. One of the things I want to say that I want to highlight, and this is one of the points that I highlighted when I'll mention the other bill in a second, that cannabis prohibition policies, law enforcement seems to believe that they need them in order to address public safety and to address violence and intercommunal violence in our community. And it's just important to know that law enforcement has not been able to provide a basis for how cannabis prohibition policy has been an effective law enforcement tool. And so I think that's something important, because I think there are folks that will push back and say, well, what about the uptick in violence and crime? And that we need to use odor in order to get after violent criminals. It's extremely important to note that the policy of cannabis prohibition has been in existence for decades at this point, and it has not demonstrated itself to be an effective tool to address public safety. So just want to throw that caveat in there. The second bill that is a priority of ours, also relating to cannabis legalization, is the fact that one of the unfinished business of the legislature was that the criminal penalties remain for possession of cannabis over the civil unit, the 2.5 ounces, and possession with intent to distribute cannabis. That criminal penalties remain. One of the things that we observe in California when they legalized cannabis was that many of the companies that were the biggest beneficiaries of the industry and wanting to eliminate the black market were trying to push legislators to be even more draconian in their enforcement of cannabis prohibition policies, even though cannabis had become legal, in order to deal with the black market cutting into their profits. So one of the things that these existing criminal penalties would do is, again, exposes black people to the criminal justice system, and in a way that doesn't actually, again, address homicide and violence that law enforcement will say they need as leverage in order to address themselves to public safety. One other thing I also want to note, and I shared this again, so I testified yesterday on SB 73 that removes these criminal penalties, and I actually used data from the Mayor's Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement that says that they did a study on homicides, I believe in 2020 and 2021 in the Western District, and they broke down the categories around the circumstances of homicide in the Western District, and only about a little bit over 14% of the homicides committed in the Western District had anything to do with illegal drug activity. This is important because this actually contrasts law enforcement, which essentially puts a majority of its focus in terms of dealing with public safety on dealing with drug trafficking as, from their perspective, the primary driver. And I think for those of us in the community who remember the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s, we're in a different moment now where when you look around, violence in our community, drug trafficking doesn't take up as much space in terms of what is driving violence in our community as it once did. And the data from the Monty office that I mentioned a moment ago provide some real important data that I think is important in dispelling the idea that these kinds of penalties are necessary in order to, again, use as a, as they call it, a tool in the toolbox to address public safety. Additionally, another one of our priorities, we're going to come back to cannabis in a second, is looking at police accountability boards. So the Maryland Police the Maryland Police Accountability Act of 2021 required the establishment of police accountability boards in every jurisdiction in the state. And those police accountability boards' primary responsibility is to take complaints from the public, do regular meetings with the local police department. And so one of the things that was unclear is whether or not local jurisdictions had the authority to give those police accountability boards independent investigatory power. This is important because we don't want investigations of misconduct and police brutality to be dependent on the internal affairs apparatus, policing themselves. We don't want that to be the sole basis of the information we have about incidences of misconduct. And so the police accountability boards in many ways have the potential to be instruments of the community to engage in its own investigation as a way to truly hold law enforcement accountable. As we've said on this podcast for years, part of the challenge for law enforcement is policing themselves. And so whatever mechanisms that we have at our disposal to be able to actually see what's going on, because law enforcement has been operating as a very insular institution, right, for many decades. And any industry without oversight and transparency is prone to corruption. And so all the corruption that we've seen over the past several years is predictable, given the lack of oversight available to the public of law enforcement. So giving the police accountability boards independent investigatory power is one mechanism for which the community can exercise oversight. This is important in the contrast. One of the bills that we worked on and were a part of getting passed in 2021, the session where the focus was a lot on policing, Anton's Law, named after Anton Black, who was killed on the Eastern Shore, I believe 2019, by police officers. Anton's Law changed the Maryland Public Information Act, where previous to the passage of that law, police investigatory records were prohibited from public disclosure. Now those police investigatory records are discretionary disclosures. But police departments that are receiving these public information act requests, there are all kinds of obstacles that are being put in order to make it more difficult to get access to those records, including things like departments charging hundreds of thousands of dollars in order to produce documents. There's a lawsuit in Montgomery County where the FOP and the county executive created an agreement that would allow the officer, the subject of the investigation, to review the documents that are being disclosed about them and provide them an opportunity to countersue in order to keep the documents from being able to be disclosed to the public. And then to get 10 days in order to investigate the records, which goes against the language that is in Anton's Law, where an officer isn't to be notified until the requester of the information receives it. So there are all these different things that are being done around the state. And this is important. The fact that there's such reluctance to disclose records about the police investigatory records says that there are things in them that would be damning if the public got a hold of. So I mention that in this context because giving the police accountability boards independent investigatory power in many ways is leverage. If they're going to get in the way of us exercising statutorily our right to get access to that information, the PAB should at least have some ability to do some investigation of law enforcement as an independent instrument of the formal police apparatus. In addition, one of the things that we were made aware of is a potential pattern and practice piece of legislation that the Attorney General has had conversations about. We look forward to talking to you more about that. The language of that hasn't dropped, but there is conversations being had about the potential for the Attorney General of Maryland, who apparently, compared to their colleagues in other states, has very limited and narrow power. Giving the Attorney General of Maryland the ability to do pattern and practice investigations of local law enforcement agencies, which could be an additional way to get access to these investigatory records and to really know what's happening. Because we don't know what's happening, particularly in many of these more remote, more conservative jurisdictions. We don't know the extent of police abuse there, right? Because the information isn't available to us. And so these are additional mechanisms of leverage that'll give us that opportunity. Lastly, in terms of our agenda, as a lot of people are aware, last session, the General Assembly elected to put the whether or not recreational cannabis will be legal on the ballot, and that they would deal with regulating the industry upon the approval of the referendum by the voters of Maryland. And so the voters have obviously approved the referendum of legalizing recreational cannabis. And so much of the effort this session will be regulating the cannabis industry. One of the things that, and I do want to give the Legislative Black Caucus of Maryland actually a ton of credit. One, for making the priorities that I mentioned earlier, the criminal penalties, odor searches. The Legislative Black Caucus of Maryland has made it a priority of theirs. And so we want to give huge praise to the Black Caucus for doing that. Black Caucus is the biggest Black caucus in the United States, about 60 representatives in the Maryland State Legislature. Additionally, we want to give credit to the Black Caucus for being extremely focused on ensuring that Black people have access to the revenue, have access to the potential wealth creation that the cannabis industry is going to produce here in Maryland. And so we're going to be looking to make sure that, to the extent possible, that not just Black people at the most elite aspects of the industry benefit. Because unfortunately, we look at the wealth disparities, Black people often aren't able to play at the level that many of them, are able to play at. And so we want to make sure that working class Black people are able to benefit from the industry. And so that'll be something that, and in fact, we were told that a bill would drop today, a very long 120-page piece of legislation that, will outline the regulation scheme. So we look forward to, looking into that and making sure that Black folks are benefiting. Again, particularly working class Black people are benefiting from it. One of the things that Governor Moore did do is made available $40 million to the Cannabis Business Assistance Fund. And that's going to be crucial for providing some capital to Black entrepreneurs that want to get into the cannabis industry. So we really encourage, a lot of people are focusing on the processors, the dispensaries, the growers. But again, if you're talking about things that are less capital intensive in terms of entry into the industry, security, social consumption sites, transportation, paraphernalia, there are a variety of other aspects of the industry where you don't have to actually touch the plant that provide business opportunities. And so we want to make sure, and I think, again, Governor Moore does, I think, deserve credit for releasing $40 million into this Cannabis Business Assistance Fund that will provide some capital for Black people to be able to get into the industry. So the opportunity is there. We'll see how it rolls out, but the opportunity is there. We want to help any way we can, and others should join in making sure that Black folks get access to those opportunities. The last thing that I'll talk about, and this isn't actually a Maryland General Assembly piece. One of the things we passed last session with the leadership of Senator Joe Carter and Senator Antonio Hayes. Senator Carter and her cannabis legalization bill, it was a section, the Community Repair and Reinvestment Fund. And that fund, it says that 30% of the tax revenues that comes to the state will go into this fund. Each jurisdiction will get a portion of those dollars. The percentage that jurisdiction gets will be produced by that jurisdiction's contribution to statewide cannabis prohibition arrest, related arrest, over the 20-year period of July 2002 to July 2022. So this essentially means that counties like Baltimore City and Prince George's County, the blackest districts that experience the highest rates of these cannabis-related arrests, will receive a lion's share of those resources in order to then distribute it equitably to where they're most needed. Each jurisdiction is going to have to pass a law that will determine how those resources are spent in their particular jurisdiction, because we didn't want to just give that power to the executive. We want to make sure that the community have an opportunity to shape how those resources are distributed. And so we're actually currently working with the city council president, Nick Mosby, and we're working with Councilman Chris Burnett on putting in Baltimore's legislation, enabling legislation to how those resources would be distributed. And, you know, the version that we've proposed to the city council will be the creation of a reparations commission, a Baltimore reparations commission. Commissioners that have rigorous knowledge about the war on drugs, rigorous knowledge about reparations, who will be able to convene to distribute the dollars that'll come to the jurisdiction through the Community Repair and Reinvestment Fund. So we want you all to look out for that. And we're actually hoping that the introduction of that piece of legislation will happen this month. So look out for that. You'll be hearing more about that as the days, in the coming days. All right, that was a lot of information. I see we have a question from Rasheen. And her question is, how do we hold the new governor accountable, particularly in light of all the excitement around this symbolic appointment? I think that's a really good question. I'll say two things that I think will be important for those that'll be watching this. The first is that it's really important for people to know what the governor does. Like, what are the responsibilities that the governor has? Because I think sometimes people will ask the governor things about legislation. And while the governor has a role in that, that's not the governor's job. The governor, their responsibility is primarily having to do with the budget and the executive function of the state of Maryland. And that budget is a crucial piece. We're talking, I think, is it the higher 30 billions of dollars in terms of the budget? Whatever the number is, the governor puts forward the budget. And so it's important in terms of holding the governor accountable, that you got to be engaging the budget, right? You have to, and we have to look at, what communities are getting capital projects, major investments, because that is the power the governor has in terms of the budget. So if you want to make sure the governor's being held accountable, it's important to look at the budget. And then secondly, to look at the agencies and who's being appointed, right? And what are the initiatives of the departments of those that he's appointing to captain positions. One of the things that will be important, I think it's important for people to be clear about, is that, Governor Hogan and his administration operated in a way where they were extremely understaffed. So one of the things that Governor Moore is having to do is to staff up agencies that haven't really been fully staffed, in several years. And so that's going to take a lot of work. And so I do think it will call for some patience and making, because there's a lot to do in terms of standing up these agencies that have been so understaffed for so long. So that'll be something I think will be important for people to be a bit patient about. But those are, I think, the most important ways to hold the new governor accountable. And then Rasheem's second question, can't we get access to information on police abuse via the Maryland Public Information Act? So when I mentioned Anton's Law, Anton's Law was technically amendments to the Maryland Public Information Act. Prior to Anton's Law's passage, police investigatory records were considered personnel files. Personnel files under the Maryland Public Information Act are prohibited from public disclosure. it's complicated because a lot of this gets into like labor regulations and labor law, like how much access to information about an individual employee of state government are you entitled to? And those questions deal with a person's privacy, deal with what collective bargaining unions negotiate for their, genre of employees. So it gets very complicated. But traditionally, and part of the argument made against it is that personnel records aren't made accessible to the public, teachers or other public employees. Now, the argument that we made is that police officers that are given the ability to take someone's life and freedom, and given the patterns of law enforcement abuse and misconduct, that we need access to those personnel files, what were formerly personnel files that are now not considered personnel files. And so, Anton's Law was an amendment to the Maryland Public Information Act. And again, what we're seeing are all types of obfuscation in order to get around disclosing these records. As I mentioned, some folks are being told that it costs, several hundreds of thousands of dollars to produce documents in terms of disclosures of police investigatory records. So, there's work to be done to get around that, to push through that. It may require some legislative changes in the future, but people continue to press. And the Fraternal Order of Police, they're already trying to sue so that the courts can say that Anton's Law is unconstitutional. So they're working to try to find ways to undermine it. But I think people continue to make these requests are going to be important. And that's why the PAB investigatory powers and the potential AG bill around pattern and practice investigations, I think, serve as additional leverage. One way or the other, people need to get access to those records, to that information, and we need to continue to use all the different routes possible to get it. Thank you for those questions. So again, this is Dayvon Love, Director of Public Policy, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. This is our first Streets of the Statehouse. Hopefully you get a gist of what our agenda is for this coming Maryland General Assembly. Look out for the legislative updates. We got some hearings in the House of Delegates next week. You'll be receiving information about that. Please watch some of the videos that have gone up that in which there's testimony on bills that we're working on. I want to just take a few minutes to really emphasize it's really important that when we put out action alerts, that you all reach out to your legislator, whether it's a tweet, an email, a phone call. Legislators, when I'm in Annapolis, they pay attention to when they get calls, emails, tweets from people who are responding to our calls for action. So our ability to be effective is directly connected to you all supporting our work in that way. So I want to ask you all to continue to support us in reaching out to your legislators, and also continue to support us by being sustainers. We're an organization that's powered by the community. We're not an appendage of any major foundation or corporation. Like, we're truly a grassroots organization that have a base of people that support our work. And that political independence is what allows us to be unapologetically Black. It allows us to say what we need to say and advocate in ways that are truly about what's in the best interest of Black people. And so we're very appreciative of the privilege that we have to be able to operate with the level of freedom to advocate unapologetically for Black people. And that's only possible because of you all that contribute to the work that we do. So please, continue to be a sustainer if you are. And if not, please consider becoming a sustainer. Go to lbsbaltimore.com/sustain and, become a sustainer. Support us by, giving a monthly contribution. And again, support us by reaching out to your legislator. All right. So with that, again, I'm Dayvon. Good to see you all this evening, and look out for legislative updates in the future. You all take care. Have a good night.